Good morning, everybody. I didn't sleep well tonight, and I'll share with you why. Last night, sorry. Yes, thank you, Judy. I obviously didn't sleep well, that's the proof. And I kept waking up with the image of the Syrian man that Lena Gbawi shared with us yesterday. I don't know how many of you were there, but she shared during lunch the story of a man who had gone to France, I believe, to work, make a little money, and then when he had enough money, he would ask his family to come over. And Lena had talked to her sister who told the story of this man, and she told the story much more beautiful than I ever can. But he was now walking the streets of the town, the French town in which he lived, losing weight every single day because he couldn't eat, and dazed, hardly able to speak. And the reason why was that he had just heard word that his mother and I believe his sister had died in an explosion, and he had no idea where his children were. And she described this so vividly that this image kept coming back to me. And when I woke up this morning, I thought, well, maybe that is a good place to start with our discussions, because at the very least we should hope, not that we can help the Syrian man today, or at the end of today, but maybe that will help to renew our commitment to make sure that there's not a lesson that we do not learn, to make sure that at the end, or maybe in 5 years from now, or hopefully sooner, there'll be a lot less Syrian men in the world. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. When I was reflecting a little bit on this panel and what we're trying to do, there is some movement upwards, I could see. If you go back to 1913 and you think about peace building, I would say it was just really only a matter between states. And it was two options. Either you negotiated as a peace builder or you had war. And then, of course, in 1913, there was this great innovation of the idea of having a court. But peace building was something between states, and what happened within states was politics. And there was no interference of the international community with that. Then in 1945, the Charter, something new. And the remarkable thing, I suppose, about the Charter, but also the tension built into it, is the fact that it starts off with we the people, but ends up creating only obligations for the member states. But the people are clearly mentioned. But still, peacekeeping or peace building, generally speaking, was something that the international community, despite the provisions of the Charter, wasn't all that involved in, except perhaps emergency relief and the traditional peacekeeping in the neutral mode that was invented by Dag Hammarskjöld. Internal affairs and politics still very much ruled. And that house came crashing down in the 1990s when we found out, and Abby, you were right in the middle on a lot of that, so was I, working for the tribunals, that most of the conflict and most of the we the peoples that were addressed were troubled by all these conflicts and suffered were internal, and that the system really didn't work. The demands on the international community to help the we the people was totally overwhelming, and we all remember Somalia, the former Yugoslavia, East Timor, just to mention a few. And out of the crisis of not really being able to deal with that, this idea of R2P, mentioned before, the responsibility to protect, emerged. But that still is not a totally clear guide on what to do. I saw this morning on the BBC website a real good explanation on the options, the legal options that relate to Syria, and the notion of R2P is mentioned quite well, but it also says, you know, it's not really a clear guidance on what to do. You could still argue this thing going many ways. Now we want to look ahead and we want to look back, and maybe we can do that with some facts that I took from what I think is one of the best research efforts over many, many years on the notion of peace building, the World Development Report 2011. One of the facts from that research is that every civil war that began since 2003 was in a country that had civil war before. So there's a real serious issue of recurring. Another fact, for every 3 years a country is affected by war and major violence, poverty reduction lags behind by 2.7 percentage points. Now, you could argue whether that's 2.3 or 2.7 or 2.8, but it's probably a lot more, and there's a clear relationship with poverty reduction. Another one I'd like to mention, the fastest governance transformation that they were able to find in the area of rule of law, the fastest, the most successful case, took 17 years. The most effective governance transformation in the area of government effectiveness took 13 years. Peace building is more needed than ever, and I think it is more difficult than ever. We really are at a time, let's go back to the Syrian man, when innovation is needed, new thinking is needed. The UN and peace builders in general are more often the target of violence themselves. It's incredibly messy. There are state actors out there who place themselves outside the realm of international law, over which we have very little grip, that act globally. So it is time that we ask ourselves, what have we learned? That's my introduction, and the people who know much more about it are here with me at the table. We have Judy Cheng-Hopkins, Assistant Secretary General for Peacebuilding. She does it, so to speak. We have Ramesh Thakur, Director of the Center for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and from the Crawford School of Public Policy. And we have Dan Smith, the Secretary General of International Alert. I will not elaborate on their CVs. You can all see that in the papers that you have. Very quickly on how we're going to approach this. Each of the speakers is going to get 10 minutes for a presentation. We will then have an interaction amongst the panel of about 30 minutes, and after that, there's lunch outside under the umbrellas.
Thank you, Sam. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and with Dan and Ramesh on the stage, and also to have been with you yesterday. I think there's no need to repeat what you had said about the relapse. The constant relapse every 5 years or so of a good majority of the countries. So countries, we have this group of countries that are constantly in and out of war. And while most of the world is progressing and moving along in terms of poverty, unfortunately, this cohort of about 20, 30 countries sink deeper and deeper into poverty. The statistics you gave, which I gave yesterday as well, I think is actually more than 2.7%, obviously. So not only are these countries, sort of in this rut, unable to get out of conflict, sinking deeper and deeper into poverty, but in recent times, they're getting even more complex. There's so many elements included now. It's just not a matter of political violence or political disagreements. It's also now drugs involved, terrorism involved, criminal activity, criminal gangs involved. So to make the whole peace-building arena even more complex than ever. So obviously, any peace-building activity has to take all this into consideration. So there are many lessons learned, obviously, from peace-building, but in the interest of time, I'm going to compress them into 5 lessons, the way I see it, 5 clear lessons learned. Number 1, first lesson is, this has been said before, no revelation, but peace. There's not a linear relationship between peacekeeping, peace building, and development. Simplistically, I think in the old days, in the early days of peacekeeping operations, I think the notion is that, don't bother us, we're not ready for peace building yet. We're here to try and keep stability. Unfortunately, that kind of thinking is short-sighted because, as I said, the situations in these countries are so fluid and so gray. And so, geographically, in terms of where the conflict is not necessarily constantly in one place or the other. So one basically strikes when the opportunities is there, and not necessarily wait for each activity to end before another one starts. So, the other side of the coin then is timing is of the essence. And if I give you an example, maybe it makes it clearer. The question of security sector reform. This is one of the major activities that my office does in most countries, because usually in the peace accord, the first thing is everybody agrees to security sector reform. Why? Why? Because the army is usually the one involved in the mischief in the first place. Let's admit it. And the army is usually overbloated in many of these countries because there are no other jobs. So because of patronage and ethnic affinities, the army just keeps growing and becomes very top-heavy. That's the characteristic in many of post-conflict countries. And so the first thing is, obviously, you have to deal with the devil. You have to professionalize the army, reduce the size of it, make it something more manageable, bring in fresh recruits, as I said, professional, and basically, the coffers of the state as well. So in Guinea, for instance, when the peace accords were signed with the new president, the first activity that people were ready to do, supposedly, was security sector reform. So very quickly we came in and did the biometric census, the first census ever done of the army in Guinea. There was no census. Lots of dead people getting salaries on the payroll. So the first thing you have to do is do a biometric census, and then identify the ones that ought to be retired, or the ones that just don't fit the bill, whose jobs are no longer needed. So that way we managed to reduce the size of the army by 15%. 15%, and then you go on from there in terms of then how do you plan then new recruits and how do you professionalize. I'm not saying this is the end all and this is success, not at all. I mean, if you know the power of the army in countries like that, I have no doubts that they will rear their heads again in the future, but you got to move in the right direction. So I think that's the main lesson. There's no quick success, there's no definite success, but you have to move in the right direction. Second lesson is national ownership, and this has been said so many times before, but I think basically there are two sins. There are two sins in national ownership. One sin, if I can put it really bluntly in the interest of time, one sin usually committed on the donor side, the donor providing the funding, wanting to do the best, well-meaning as hell, really well-meaning, wanting to do the best, but not taking, as has been said so many times before, local knowledge, and especially when it comes to the area of law, traditional law, not taking into account that a good 80 to 90% of many of these countries depend on traditional law to solve their problems, not so much the Western concept of law. So on the part of the donor side, taking national ownership seriously, because it's only national actors. Only when national actors want peace to be sustained will peace be sustained. There's nothing us international people can do except to support and facilitate the process. But I want to also put the blame on the other side, on the countries themselves, the countries coming out of war. A lot of times I think there's a misconception of the word ownership. A lot of times it is the power of definition, defining what needs to be done. True, we have to follow what the government defines, but then it is too much emphasis on that definition and too much emphasis on concepts like sovereignty, which is sort of misplaced, and it's kind of a false sense of sovereignty, because for me, sovereignty means very much the responsibility and accountability to deliver and to be held accountable. But a lot of times we miss that side of the equation, stressing more the front side, which is defining, and especially defining over resources, wanting control over the resources. So there, another thing we have to bear in mind in this post-conflict context is also government local officials. They're new. A lot of them have just come in. I'm talking about, for instance, like countries like South Sudan. By the way, the president dissolved all the ministries and reappointed. Ministers, top-level officials are pulled in 1,000 different directions. So a lot of times it's really hard for them to focus on any one area. I think the well-meaning ones are trying to do the best they can, Some others are not so well-meaning, so they're busy on other things, I don't know what. But we have to be mindful that when we enter post-conflict situations, to try, to demand this and that of government is just not going to fly. And usually people are very polite and say yes to everything, but things never get done. So for me, that is a major lesson. You never ask, can you do A, B, and C? You actually ask further questions like, do you have the facilities? How many trained personnel do you have in this area? Who will you be decentralizing to the rural areas? All these questions before accepting the word at it. So national ownership is key. Inclusiveness, this has already been said before, but I would say that inclusiveness is needed both during the negotiation and the mediation stage, so that so that people buy into the concept. You cannot have this wonderful progress, a progress to prosperity, which is some of the slogans that we use for a lot of these, that the governments have used, which are great, but then everybody has to understand it. What does it mean, those words? So there has to be buy-in from all segments of society. You have to communicate, one of your principles, to communicate to broad swath of society, for them, especially to local leaders. I'm not one of those romantics that think that everybody ought to be on the same page when it comes to understanding these concepts, but at least local leaders. We have to get local leaders involved. So at the negotiation stage, at the mediation stage of peacemaking, but also at the governance stage, there has to be inclusiveness. Unfortunately, in a lot of post-conflict settings, winner takes all. Winner takes all, and we see the consequences. Central African Republic, 7 leaders since independence in 1960, 5 of them came in through coups. 5 through coups. So you can imagine in a country poor as it is, but yet with some natural resources, diamonds, etc., when you win and you exclude everybody else, whatever it is, your ethnic group or your group, and you exclude everybody, what do you think the others will be doing? Because these are not viable economies. There's really nothing much going on. They're planning for the next attack in order to overthrow you, and that's why we have coup after coup after coup. And same goes in Guinea-Bissau and so many of these countries. So the spoils of war, the winner takes all. These concepts have to be. We really have to do away with these concepts, and hopefully through time and peace building activities and more exposure of these countries, we will get it. Next, conflict analysis. Again, in a post-conflict situation, there's so much to do. Where does one start? So a very good lesson learned for us is you start at the beginning. You do a proper conflict analysis of the country you're dealing with. Each one is different. So you identify conflict drivers, and obviously you want to address those first. It's never a sequence, it's never one after the other, but it's usually a multiple set of activities that you have to do. Last lesson learned, women in peace building, I've said this yesterday, but I'll say it again. Women are not to be seen as the ultimate victims only. Yes, they are victims, terrible, horrible victims, but they're not to be seen as victims, and they are to be seen as agents of change, because as I said yesterday, they have an innate, almost in the DNA, an innate interest in peace. Why? Because they're the bedrock of the family, they're the caregivers, they care for nourishment of their children, education, and the future of their children. They have a stake in the peace. Everybody does. But for women, it's a different matter altogether. So to exclude them from mediation, from negotiation, to exclude them from recovery programs, to exclude them from politics and political life is very short-sighted and foolhardy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judy. Now, we were supposed to have met before to see which order we would took, but we didn't. So maybe Ramesh, and I hope I'm not too quick now in giving you the floor. You don't mind doing it? Okay.
Thanks, Sam. Sam, you said in your introductory remarks, R2P does not provide a clear guide. Gareth Evans and I wrote the report. Let me assure you, it provides a very clear guide. The difficulty is selective interpretation and application. The parties in Syria have ignored the second part of paragraph 138 that Hans Corell read out to us, which says very clearly action through the Security Council and in accordance with the Charter. So the clarity is there. It doesn't suit people necessarily, and that's a different issue. Now, Abby Williams said people have come from far and near. I think I'm from the far end of the spectrum. I'm not sure how many of you have done the journey from Australia or to Australia from Europe and back. I spent 3 nights in the plane in the journey both ways, and I have 10 minutes. So weigh each word very carefully. In his 2005 report In Larger Freedom, Kofi Annan noted that poverty cannot be eradicated in conditions of insecurity. Sustainable peace cannot be achieved amidst persistent poverty, and neither peace nor development is possible or meaningful amidst widespread and systematic abuses of human rights. Our host, Abby Williams, of course, had a major role in drafting that report. Peacebuilding gives us the conceptual bridge to connect and integrate these 3 great normative agendas that define the modern United Nations. But the challenge remains of how best and most effectively to shift peacebuilding from a normative agenda to a political project in order to operationalize it. Post-conflict transition is a complex set of interconnected processes of change in political, social, and economic relations that is neither smooth nor linear, but ragged, with achievements being offset by reverses. Our task is 1, to comprehend the critical junctures in peace talks, 2, to identify the obstacles and common points of agreement in constitutional negotiations, 3, to recommend the best case institutional bargains that balance the past history, present military balance, and future shared needs of the various conflict parties, and 4, to recommend how outsiders can best assist local efforts in peace negotiations, institutional engineering, and the implementation of the agreements through appropriate context-sensitive strategies and resources without appropriating ownership of the process or responsibility for the outcome. Many of these choices and strategies can be informed by international debate and best practice. But no system of governance will survive and thrive if it's a foreign import. Instead, it must connect to and build on local traditions, belief systems, and governance practices. A prerequisite to meeting the challenge is building state capacity. The creation of government with legislative and executive powers that can be exercised effectively to mobilize and allocate resources and values authoritatively, and of apolitical bureaucratic structures, civil service, judiciary, police, army, supported by an ideology that legitimates the role of neutral state authority in maintaining social order through prescribed procedures and the rule of law. The state has to play an active role in building the legal and institutional infrastructure of a market economy as well as a social democracy, so that public power is exercised for the public good to ensure public safety, educate and train citizens and the workforce, enforce contracts, property rights, safeguard labor rights, promote human rights, conserve the environment, look after public health, protect minorities, defend national security, so on. In sum, the essence of the peacebuilding project is to build a state that is effective, efficient, and legitimate, so that it may have full ownership of and responsibility for the provision of core public goods, sustainable security, development, peace, and justice. A strong state is necessary to ensure order, look after national security, and intervene in the management of the market economy. But the consolidation of state power can be used in the name of national security and law and order to suppress individual, group, or even minority demands on the government and to plunder the resources of a society. So what is needed is a balanced, strong state, balanced among citizens, civil society, media, market, and the state, and within state institutions, balanced among the different components like the legislature, executive, judiciary, bureaucracy, police, and military. Examples of unbalanced states include apartheid South Africa, Suharto's Indonesia, and the military regime in Myanmar. The difficulties of transition from the authoritarian national state to people-empowered democratic states has been shown only too starkly across the Arab world in recent years. There is a surprising dearth of literature in the best fit between type of political systems and local circumstances. In the stable, mature, and advanced democracies, there is a comparable commitment to the values and principles of liberal democracy and market economy, but no uniformity of pattern in the structures, institutions, and processes. Some have presidential governments, others are parliamentary republics or constitutional monarchies. Many stable European nations are leading examples of consociational democracy, while the United States and Australia are prime examples of robust adversarial politics. There is a great diversity of electoral systems, party systems, electoral cycles, terms of governments. These institutional differences reflect the particular historical patterns of political evolution in the European, American, and Australian settings. But the international community, I think, has been singularly hesitant to explore the connection between differences in institutional arrangements and local variables, with a view to maximizing the prospects of peace, democracy, and market economy, taking root and flourishing. Would Afghanistan have been better off with parliamentary government? When and where might proportional representation better facilitate post-conflict reconciliation? Should we recommend territorial pluralism for Sri Lanka? Under what circumstances do elections help to build a new democratic order? And under what circumstances can they undermine democracy and pave the way for a return to conflict? The first and most urgent requirement, I think, for war-torn and post-conflict societies is to stabilize the security situation. The second is the recovery of domestic, regional, and international legitimacy. Third, the reconstruction of national infrastructure. And the final goal then is nation building, state building, and economic development. Now, where does the liberal peace paradigm come into this as the final part of my presentation? Democracy is a political system marked by institutional arrangements that permit the change of government reflecting popular will without violence. In consolidated democracies, electoral processes are nested in a wider frame of norms and institutions which ensure that the outcome of exercises in popular choice are accepted. Otherwise, there is a risk that the results of popular choice will either be repudiated by the losers, Angola 1992, or result in systemic instability, Egypt this year, or even carnage, East Timor in 1999. The difficulty, of course, is that holding an election is a discrete event which organizers can point to and paint as a success and leave, whereas the establishment of the rule of law embedded in institutions is a slow process which does not lend itself easily to instant celebrations and photo opportunities. The UN's focus should be on institution building, not just holding elections. Without a framework that protects citizen freedoms, the choices they make is a form of theater, not an exercise in popular will. So elections should be preceded by concerted steps to establish the rule of law and restore a functioning judiciary, police, and law enforcement. Let me assure you this was not done in coordination with Hans's keynote address. It just happens to complement what he said very nicely. A democratic society without justice is less appealing than a just society in which elections have been delayed until it is safe for them to be held. The rule of law as a political principle has arguably taken root in Namibia, but not yet in Cambodia, Afghanistan, East Timor, Iraq, or Libya. So elections, democracy, and inclusive power sharing arrangements are commendable, both for instrumental reasons, risk reduction function, and intrinsic reasons. They are valued end in themselves. But democracy, economic growth, and poverty alleviation are neither self-generating nor self-guaranteeing. The global financial crisis confirmed that while governments are fallible, markets too are imperfect, and both need each other's tough discipline to curb and correct excesses. That greed is not always good and can drive short-term profiteering for individuals while imposing significant long-term pain for the collective, and that globalization has losers as well as winners, a dark side that threatens as well as the bright lights that beckon. the track record of the liberal peace paradigm in building stable, peaceful, and prosperous democratic orders in societies coming out of conflict is, at best, patchy. One strand of the enterprise concerns the design of institutional frameworks to promote power sharing instead of exclusion, bargaining rather than warring, and compromise instead of the quest for outright victory with the attendant risk of total defeat for the other conflict party. To be sure, institutional arrangements can have built-in biases that favor and disadvantage the different parties. Alternatively, they can provide the sites and venues for resolving disputes peacefully and settling conflicts through compromise and mutual accommodation. When Democrats disagree on the substance of policy, they can still agree on the structures and procedures through which to resolve the differences and accept the outcome peacefully. This raises two different prior questions. Do power-sharing institutions work, or are peace-building and democratic state-making enterprises mutually incompatible? We've assumed the compatibility. I don't think we've actually problematized it and studied it. One final comment. In the 3 decades, 1980 to 2010, 80% of the world's total poverty alleviation took place in one country, China. A one-party state ruled by a communist party. It provided authoritarian but stable and orderly government. A government that had won power by military means after more than a century of foreign humiliations, attacks, invasions, and a bitter civil war. In other words, a post-conflict country par excellence that has demonstrated peace-building skills and success on a scale that is both unrivaled and unimaginable. So where in the literature do we find references to and theorization about China as a model of peace-building? In a recent TED Talk on 3rd July last month, a Shanghai-born and bred-based entrepreneur, Eric Lee, and I commend you to that TED Talk if you haven't seen it, it's wonderful. He observed that the 3 dominant assumptions of the liberal democratic governance paradigm are that one-party states are politically closed, operationally rigid, and illegitimate. Instead, he argues, China's one-party system has proven over 6 decades the political virtues of meritocracy, adaptability, and legitimacy, where the people massively believe that the country's best years are still ahead of it, and the government and regime enjoy levels of popular support that most contemporary Western democracies, including my own in Australia, can only dream of. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramesh. And may I now give the floor to you, Dan?
Yes. Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Ramesh, for setting up perfectly a talk entitled The Role of Civil Society in Peacebuilding by referring to a country where it doesn't. In International Alert, the organization which I head, I am robust in my resistance to discussions based around definitions. An organization like Alert can happily spend days on end discussing peace, building, actor, etc. What do we really mean? And I have tried to encourage people to not talk about the words, but to talk about the subject and the problems and the issues and get over the definitional questions. However, every generalization has an exception, even that one, and therefore I'm going to begin with a question of definition. Because I think that the simple question of what do you mean when you use the word civil society, and then especially in the context of the role of civil society in peacebuilding or in anything else, causes an awful lot of confusion. And one thing it does is that it encourages people, especially as I see it in the UN, in the news media, in development agencies like DFID and CEDA and so on, to think of civil society as being a conglomeration of organizations, and then to think of it as possible for somebody or some organization or some group to represent civil society, and it being possible to ask civil society to do something. Let me begin by dispelling all of those notions. Civil society, as we generally use it, confuses two different root sets of meaning. One comes from Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist. In the prison notebooks, he wrote about civil society as a space. He didn't talk about civil society as being a group of organizations. He wrote about it as being what it is that gets between the state and the individual and protects the individual and leads to a completely different political formation in Western Europe, where civil society is strong, compared to Eastern Europe and the old Tsarist Russia, where civil society had been very weak. The second route by which the term civil society has come to us is much newer. It comes from György Konrad, a Hungarian writer writing during the period of the Cold War when Hungary was in the Warsaw Pact. And he talked about civil society then as being the organizations, independent of state control, which were able to act. So on the one hand, you have a concept of civil society as a space, and on the other, you have a concept of essentially civil society organizations. And I think it would be much easier if we were to distinguish in that way. And what I will argue is that there are a large number of cases, in many instances, civil society and civil society organizations are both essential ingredients of peace building, but they're not sufficient conditions for its success. So don't ask what civil society thinks. You remember the old thing from Kissinger of, who did he call if he wanted to know what Europe's policy was? Well, now his successor can call Catherine Ashton and problem solved. But if you want to know what British civil society thinks, or Dutch civil society, I have no idea. I lived in Norway for 10 years, and Norway is a country of statistics. They love statistics. All the Scandinavian social democracies do. There's a generalization for you. And one statistic which I liked was that there are, if you count up the membership of Norwegian civil society organizations, you find that there are more Norwegians who belong to civil society organizations than there are Norwegians. Because many belong to more than one. I mean, the explanation is there's no paradox in that, but it's interesting to think about, isn't it? If you ask what civil society is thinking, and it comes down to Sven Gunnar and his, are you asking Sven Gunnar in his place as a supporter of the Norwegian Refugee Council, as a member of the Norwegian Birds Protection Society, as a member of the Norwegian Rambling Association, or because he goes to church? Which Sven Gunnar do you want? Right. So civil society, in a way, is as diverse as people are. Civil society as a space is a cacophonous, chaotic space. As civil society organizations jostle with each other, they disagree, they try to climb on each other's shoulders, they try to pinch each other's members and grants and so on, and that is exactly how it should be. That is a sign of healthy civil society and strong, bustling, competitive, healthy civil society organizations. So what is the place of each in peace building? Let me move first to the space that civil society is. Where do the ways, where do the norms, where do the culture of respect for the rule of law, of understanding the culture of democracy, of recognizing that however much I really loathe the parties which I didn't vote for in the UK election in 2010, they did kind of between them get a majority of the votes, and they do have every right to form a government, and I actually believe in that system. Where does that culture come from? What sustains it? What keeps it going? Respect for the rule of law, the idea of active citizenship, all of these grow from the health and the vibrancy of civil society. It is the place in which, if you think that the energy of people for peace building is important as a part of the success of peace building, if you think that inclusivity, as Judy emphasized as the third or fourth of her 5 lessons of peace building. If you think it's important, then civil society is fundamental, because that is the space in which that energy is mobilized. And additionally, as I've said already, civil society is important. The stronger the civil society is, the more protection sits between the state and the individual, the more protection for the individual, for their rights, the more chance, therefore, they have to be active citizens. Civil society organizations, then, are, in a sense, the organized actors in that space. Individuals are also the actors in that space, but civil society organizations are one of the best ways, one of the few ways, really through to those people acting in that space. But civil society organizations are highly diverse. Most of the best acronyms go along with NGOs rather than CSOs, non-governmental organizations. But they are, I'm using the term CSO, civil society organization, interchangeably with NGO. You must know all of these acronyms: the MANGOs, the GONGOs, the mafia-associated NGOs, the GONGOs are the government-organized NGOs, MONGOs.
What a mango?
Mango is mafia-associated. Mongo is my own NGO, the one I can take out for a little walk on the lead and get some grants. And my favorite, the Gringo, the grant-run international NGO. There are also civil society organizations which locally in post-conflict countries, using the language of national ownership, using the language of inclusivity, are actually just smoke and mirrors. They know how to write good grant proposals, and they know how to write reasonable reports. And in between, there's not an awful lot. And there are others, sometimes but not always, that have a less professional appearance, which are authentic, which are connected to, are part of the societies in which they're operating. The range of activities is also enormous and diverse. There are chambers of commerce, there are religious groups, there are women's groups, there are youth groups, there are interest-based groups, rights-based groups, protection for this local area, for those animals, for those birds, and so on, all a part of that civil society. There is nothing magical about civil society organizations and what they can do. They are often essential, they are never sufficient. They cannot do what governments and political parties can do, but they can actually do an awful lot of things that governments and political parties cannot do. And getting that point across is actually one of the most sort of frustrating and interesting intellectual discussions you can have in many different political and social contexts, and is very often when the light bulb moment occurs, and the recognition that, yes, these organizations can do something that those ones can't. That's often quite a breakthrough moment in developing a certain kind of momentum for the development of civil society and stronger basis for peace building. And the result of this really is that when you think about civil society organizations operating in that civil society space, they're much more likely to be effective when they are working with the grain than when they're working against it. If a government is entirely uninterested in the responsible and careful and nuanced work of building peace in its own society, unfortunately, civil society organizations cannot substitute for the grotesque ineffectiveness and incompetence and ruthlessness of that government. They can put brakes on it, they can limit the damage, they can hinder the decline, but they cannot steer everything onto the right course. You've basically got to have government action going in the right kind of direction, and then you can get civil society action effectively moving in that same way. Not always supporting it, by the way. Government actors too often interpret that kind of thought as being, yes, the civil society actors should support the government of the day. That's not what the meaning is. The chaotic and cacophonous nature of civil society will continue to be a strength. But civil society organizations working for peace are more effective when the government is doing the same thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, let's zoom in on some of these issues with a little more depth. There's almost too much on the table, so I just need to select a few. Judy, you mentioned national ownership, how important that is, and how difficult that is to get. Ramesh, the issue of institutional bargains, getting constitutional bargains going, came up in your talk, and we've just heard about civil society. And I'm just trying to, picture it very, very practically. And our institute is now involved in something in Mali, but it all starts somewhere. And generally, I find that it starts with the UN, with Judy. There is a problem, a crisis, and people somehow get involved. It's not a China, where they say the government. There's a clear government who says we will do whatever we want and we'll ask your help when we need it, but for the rest we'll do it ourselves. I mean, to what extent is the UN, and are there lessons in that beginning that we should be learning about this first moment, this government or a few people in the government or a few people asking the UN for help, like I've seen in the beginning in Mali? And to what extent is the UN then able to step in and say, okay, we'll be the coordinator, we'll start this process, we'll start somehow involving the different actors? Because you are often looked at as the big flag, the blue flag, the leader. Maybe we could start there. Yep.
I think it's as I said. I think when the peace has come, the peace accord, and everybody's laid down arms, and okay, now what? We have to develop the country. Let's move forward. So in the best case scenario, you actually have governments actually articulating and writing a roadmap, so to speak. Some call it the path to prosperity, come up for an agenda for change. Burundi, Sierra Leone, Liberia, each one has their own slogan. And sometimes with some international help, but by and large, they are governments' identified programs. That's fantastic. That's not necessarily the case in many of the other post-conflict countries. I don't see any such roadmap in Central African Republic or Guinea-Bissau, for that matter, except for, I don't want to be cynical, as Hans Corell said, don't be cynical. So, but in some of the countries, let's admit it, there's really very little in that. Okay, then the next step. And then next step, I think, in all good intentions, I think then the UN or international community, not just the UN, comes in. Then how do we flesh out the details of this path to prosperity or this roadmap? And then we start, building in projects, building in activities, and that's where sometimes things go awry. The balance between how much local ownership. But they're too slow. They don't show up at meetings. They don't even have a car. They don't have a phone. We can't get them. So we got to do this because there's a deadline, and we got to get past this hump before we can get to the next step. So the dilemmas that confront us daily in terms of when do you sort of shortchange and move on for the interest of getting something done versus bringing everybody in on the same page and thus maybe not doing anything for months and months to come. Mm-hmm. Because as I said, this is the dilemma. Even in all good intentions in these post-conflict states, because of the fragile nature and the newness of coming into government, a lot of these ministers and officials that I see are pulled in 1,000 different directions. This conference here, this UN meeting here, this one, and so the key is how do we balance that, and So I think so there is so the secret is to find. I think whatever activity we do, in my old age, I've now come to realize, don't be so ambitious. Look at what activity it is that you want to be doing, and then find a national champion. There's actually somebody nationally who really believes in doing this particular thing, and is gonna, and you're gonna work with this person full time on this project. I.e., it's anchored in the national context. There's a national actor. And then, yes, and then you be very patient in terms of how you move forward with the progress of the project, as opposed to say, oh, there's no national actor, they're not interested, they're traveling all the time, so I'm going to bring in an international person, and that person's going to deliver A, B, C, and D right away, fast. So one very good example is, for instance, I was very heartened in Southern Sudan. They have this wonderful project there with IGAD, meaning that South Sudan being such a new country, they're learning from neighboring countries, Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, bringing in civil servants to come help them set up departments, veterinary department, planning department, etc. Strangely, in South Sudan, this was one of the most successful things I've seen, because there was a national actor, the head of the civil service, who actually ran this program, brought these experts in, and made sure they were integrated with whatever they were trying to build locally, capacity development.
Okay, well, thank you. Ramesh, can I link that to something you said? You seem to say, but maybe I misunderstood, that the first emphasis should be on capacity building, and then you organize elections and all the other stuff. Could you elaborate a little bit on that in the light of what Judy's just said?
I think about the United Nations, let me begin with that 2 points of view. One, when you think of the problems that were alluded to by Hans and the mayor about Syria, a cynical description of the United Nations, or a cynic's description, is that the United Nations exists so that nations who are unable to do anything individually can get together to decide that nothing can be done collectively. Against that, there is a comment from Cecil DeMille, I think, on Richard Wagner's music. The interesting thing about his music is that it ain't as bad as it sounds. I think the same applies to the United Nations. It's not quite as bad as it sounds. It's a site for creative tension between we the peoples and member governments, between the national interest and the international interest, between idealism and realism, and all these do exist. But it is an institutional repository of lessons learned and best practice going back over several decades that collectively exceeds the expertise available in any country, in any overseas development ministry. And as much of the distortions result from donor pressure as from the UN's institutional shortcomings, and donor pressure reflecting donor values, domestic constituencies and priorities, rather than the needs or the perspectives of the UN technical experts. So let's remember that. The state capacity, you will get nothing without state capacity. You will get nowhere without state capacity. Local ownership, the phrase is absolutely meaningless and a trite slogan if you don't have state capacity. It is a fundamental prerequisite of any progress on any front. The question then becomes how to balance state capacity amongst the different components so that you don't end up with a national security state. How to balance considerations of long-term power-sharing arrangements where every segment of society feels it is a legitimate stakeholder and is therefore prepared to accept exactly along the lines that Dan said, that if my side loses elections, never mind, the procedures and structures were authentic and we agreed with that, and we'll wait our next turn and try again, or try and influence the policies in the meantime. Because, of course, if you have that legitimate sense of a neutral state, then they don't govern like the Muslim Brotherhood tried in Egypt, only for one side. They still take in the interests of the other side, A, because it's legitimate and proper, B, because next time they might be in power, and we don't want them to suppress us. So you have the prerequisite of a necessary state capacity, without which it cannot collect taxes, it cannot provide services, it cannot ensure order, it cannot maintain national security. And therefore it can perform none of the critical functions. But B, then, make it legitimate as well as effective and efficient.
But legitimate, and then you're saying, you were saying don't rush immediately to elections.
That's right. It takes, the statistics you were giving out, 17 years and 30 years. Right. We did a seminar when I was still the UN official on 2 projects that we completed, one on democratization in the Middle East, two on moving from civil strife to civil society. And we did a seminar in the Secretariat, all-day seminar, in June 2003. We had a BBC reporter, interviewer, who came and interviewed our project participants. And we said, and they wanted to talk about Iraq. This is June 2003. And we said on our studies, we would anticipate a minimum of 5 years of foreign presence for them to stabilize and leave things behind. They never aired that interview. You know why? Because the editor in London said, these guys are just academics, they don't know what they're talking about. Iraq is done, everything's solved. Here we are a decade later. So yes, it is a long-term process. It's always work in progress.
Well, then practically speaking, what you're saying is you would need, in advance of elections, other ways of organizing legitimacy.
You need to think through, just as you need to think through the aftermath of invasions, you need to think through the aftermath and long-term system that you want in place through your interventions. What is the long-term institutional setup you want? How do you achieve that? Is that the best fit with local realities? Build it patiently and slowly without undermining what you want in the long term, but without running against the grain of existing social norms. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
Thank you, Dan. I think that's an interesting bridge to you. I think two things we picked up here. One is this problem of finding national champions, and the second is the challenge of organizing legitimacy without having elections yet. Yeah. On the way to a stable situation in which you can have elections. What role of civil society? What things could you?
I'll give you one example, which was the Democratic Republic of Congo about 8-9 years ago. Peace agreement had been signed. The four main armed groups had come together. They had a deal. There was going to be elections in a year's time. And it was actually civil society pressure, both from a very sort of rudimentary Congolese civil society organizations and from international organizations working in DRC, who said the conditions in which you can have elections don't exist yet. Right? Now, from the point of view of international players, say in the British Foreign Office or the US Department of State, all the pressure they were hearing for national ownership was have elections now, because they were hearing it from the people who were going to win out through those elections, which by being incomplete and being inadequate would be part of a system of power that would essentially share out the goods and the control of the state between those four groups. But that was not going to be something that you would recognize as being democracy. In fact, in my view, there was finally, I think, a delay of about 18 months in having the election. In my view, that wasn't nearly long enough. But there is a difficulty because people also want participation. So even outside of the four major armed groups, there are people who are saying, well, how do we participate? How do we have a voice? And one way in which you can have a voice is through civil society organizations and in that space of civil society. Another way, of course, is to start at different levels of government, to start at local government, provincial government, and so on. I mean, one of the issues here, two issues here, I think. Firstly is that the UN, as much as I was saying about civil society organizations, the UN needs a government to be working with. And therefore state capacity is key. But you don't, as I think Ramesh is making clear, you don't just have no capacity, now you have capacity. State all the time is a process. I mean, our states in Western Europe are still works in progress. So the state is constantly being built, made, remade, renegotiated, rediscussed. And at the same time, the state is also, at its best, it's a place where people can come together. I mean, it's where you get the meeting of all of the different interests and groups in society, and where you get some kind of consensus about what the common ground is, where it's possible to go forward. And these will be the lasting assumptions that all governments of different political colours will act on. But you can't create that immediately. So then national ownership or local ownership, whichever term you use, cannot be simply about the government. And it cannot simply be about those parties that signed the peace deal. It's got to be, I think, a broader conception of what the national or the nation or the local can be. And it seems to me that the only place where you can turn for that broader kind of national ownership and participation and inclusivity, as Judy was saying, is to civil society space and civil society organizations. Where you don't have those civil society organizations strong enough and you don't have that civil society space rich enough, there are going to be really serious difficulties, and peace building is going to go very slow. That's when you get to the 30 years rather than the 17, and you get beyond the 30 years, because it takes so long to get any traction for forward progress.
I think participation, empowerment, and protection of citizens from arbitrary harassment and confiscation of property, etc., are more important than elections. And in particular circumstances and contexts, these ends can be better achieved by working through civil society than through elections.
Okay, may I, before I turn the floor to the audience, just ask one more question. I mean, do we have enough, because that seems to be popping up in everything you're saying as well, do we have enough or good enough analytical tools to know what's going on in a country before you start interacting? I mean, clearly here, the DFID people were talking, just didn't have the full picture. And you mentioned that as well, that Judy, the importance of conflict analysis. I mean, is that an area where we need to work, where we need more than there is? Or are we generally, do we have tools, we're just not using them right? How would you?
We don't have enough. One of the reasons is we look to the wrong models, and that was the point of my looking at China when I ended up. The biggest laboratory by far for studying elections, by far, is India. Mm-hmm. How many people look to India as a possible model, particularly if you're talking about contexts in poor countries and developing countries of how to do things? That one comment applies across the board. The literature is dominated by Westerners. So is the senior policy-making system in the UN. The result is a neglect of the best and most appropriate lessons for transferring across to different contexts. That still needs to be done. We haven't got enough.
Thank you. Dan, you had a point.
Yeah, so I agree with Ramesh on the models, but I actually think in terms of the tools, the analytical frameworks and so on, we've got plenty. What we don't have is people able to use them. I think that is much more the issue. People able to use them and people with the incentives to use them. I don't think that that these issues are to be resolved by working on yet another conflict analysis tool. Right? These issues are to be resolved in the longish, on the medium term, over 5 to 10 years, by thinking about how people who are working in these areas, whether in national governments or the international system or in NGOs, what is their professional development? And especially also how to get the academic world more usefully engaged in some of this, to do real analysis of the situation there, rather than simply more on the methodology, more on the framework, more on the theory, and so on. All of which is important, I grant. I used to run an academic research institute, but actually what I want to know is who is who and what is what in this part of Mali right now, because that's what will help. And it's to get that kind of focus and that kind of knowledge. And it is difficult. I'm not saying that this is an easy task and people have been just stupid to let it be. But I think the issue sits much more in terms of professional competence rather than availability of analytical frameworks.
Thank you. Judy, do you have
No, I agree completely. I think, so let's put it down to a simple term, organizational culture. The organizational culture has to encourage and reward and incentivize this kind of behavior on the part of us, the civil servants. One has to, it's, as you say, it's not that the academic material is not there, that analysis is not there. It's a matter of having, somebody sitting in a position to have that bird's eye view, seeing what the problem is in Guinea-Bissau or whatever, and being able to marry and bring this academic expertise with useful analysis, not something that something relevant to what problem we're trying to solve at this particular point, to bring that together so that then you get the best of both worlds. You get the ability to operate something, to operationalize something with some additional very useful thinking. The problem, as I said, is the organizational culture, that the project manager, whoever, the program officer, has to have that incentive to be able to reach out and do that. And so the organizational culture has to reward that, as opposed to whatever, kissing up to your superiors and then getting promoted.
Yep.
Sorry to be so blunt.
That's a universal trait.
That's pretty good. Okay, so this discussion brings together a number of points. I'll quickly try and summarize them, and then we go into the discussion with the audience. We first of all, I think, zoomed in on the 20-30 states that keep relapsing. We did not talk extensively about China and some of the others. Secondly, Judy made it clear that in some instances, states are able to come up with some kind of roadmap themselves, but in other cases they don't. So there's a question there: when do they, when don't they, and how do we make that happen? Secondly, once you have a roadmap, there's this difficulty of where do you start, and essentially, basically, it seems that you just start, you find your national champions, and you get going. But there's a bit of an issue there, that once you have the roadmap, how do you translate that into concrete activities in a good way? I think what comes very clearly across here is the importance of developing state capacity and the difficulty also of doing that, not to rush to elections, the state as a process, etc., etc. And we've just had a few interesting thoughts on analytical tools. And it seems, and I would also concur with that it's probably more difficult to get people to use them and get organizations to really use them than to invent them. We've got quite a lot of them. So these are a number of points that have come up. I would like to thank you very much, panel members, for this great discussion. Thank you.
Abby.